The nursery was ash and ruined by the time I got home, and the first thing I noticed wasn't the smell of burnt paint or the black smoke stain crawling up the wall behind where the crib used to stand, it was the small brass frame lying face down in the wreckage, the only photograph I had left of my mother, her glass cracked straight across her smiling face, and I remember standing in that doorway feeling nothing at all, because somewhere deep down, I had already known this day was coming. My mother-in-law stood behind me in the hallway wringing her hands, saying over and over that it was an accident, that a candle must have tipped, that she'd only stepped out for 5 minutes, and I looked at her and said the 4 words that made her face go white. I already knew, Linda. My name is Emily Carter, I'm 34 years old, and I live in a quiet suburb just outside Charlotte, North Carolina, in a house my husband Daniel and I bought 2 years ago with the kind of hope that only first-time homeowners understand. The kind where you paint every room a color that means something to you and imagine your whole life unfolding inside those walls. If you're new here, my name is Emily, and this channel is called Silent Revenge Stories, a place where women like me finally get to say out loud what we spent years swallowing in silence. So if you've ever sat across from a family member and smiled while your heart was breaking, hit that subscribe button right now, because you are exactly who this story is for, and trust me, this one gets worse before it gets so much better. I was 7 months pregnant with our first child, a little girl we'd already named Grace, after my mother, who passed away 3 years before I ever met Daniel. My mother raised me alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Gastonia, worked double shifts at a diner for 15 years, and never once let me feel like we were missing anything, and when she died of a sudden heart attack at 59, the only things I had left of her were a chipped porcelain rabbit she kept on her nightstand, a hand-stitched quilt she made the winter I turned 10, and that photograph, the one of her laughing on the porch of our old apartment, taken the summer before I left for college. Those 3 objects sat in the nursery I had spent 4 months building for Grace, arranged on a shelf above the crib so that even though my mother would never meet her granddaughter, some piece of her would still be in the room every single night. Daniel's mother, Linda, never approved of me, not from the very first dinner I had at her house 6 years ago, when she asked me in front of the entire family what my father did for a living, already knowing the answer was nothing, because he left before I was born. Linda comes from what she calls old Charlotte money, though most of it disappeared 2 divorces ago, and she has spent every year of our marriage finding small, precise ways to remind me that I am not the woman she pictured for her only son. She criticized my cooking at Thanksgiving in front of 12 relatives. She rearranged my kitchen cabinets while house-sitting and acted surprised when I asked her to put things back. She once told Daniel, within earshot of me, that I was pleasant enough for what she assumed was a temporary phase. I let it go, every single time, because Daniel loved his mother, and I loved Daniel, and I told myself that once the baby came, things would soften, that grandchildren have a way of melting even the coldest hearts. I was wrong, and some quiet, unspoken part of me knew I was wrong the entire time. The nursery had been my sanctuary during the hardest pregnancy of my life. I'd had 2 miscarriages before Grace, both in the first trimester, both times watching Linda's expression shift from concern to something closer to relief, though she never said it outright. When I finally hit the 2nd trimester safely with Grace, I started building that room like it was a promise I was making to myself, painting the walls a soft sage green because it was my mother's favorite color, hand-lettering a small wooden sign that said, Grace's Garden, and finding, at an estate sale 2 towns over, an antique oak rocking chair almost identical to the one my mother used to sit in when she read to me as a little girl. Every object in that room meant something. Every object was a piece of a woman my daughter would never get to know, except through the things I had carefully placed around her. Linda started asking to babysit our older dog, Biscuit, so she could stop by and water the plants while we were at work, and looking back now, I can see exactly how the pattern began, small requests, small favors, small windows of unsupervised access to our home, and I let her have every single one of them because I still wanted, so badly, for her to be a grandmother my daughter could love. It was a Tuesday in April when I came home from my prenatal appointment and found the front door unlocked, which was strange, because Daniel was still at work and I certainly hadn't left it that way. I walked through the house calling out, thinking maybe Linda had stopped by to feed Biscuit, and that's when I smelled it, the acrid, chemical smell of something burned, and I found the nursery door half open with smoke still hanging faintly in the air near the ceiling. The crib, the one my husband had spent an entire weekend assembling by hand, was scorched black along one side. The curtains I'd sewn myself were gone entirely, reduced to ash in a metal trash can that had clearly been used to try and contain the fire before someone thought better of it and simply left the room to smolder. The quilt my mother made was ruined beyond saving, a hole burned straight through the center, and the porcelain rabbit lay shattered on the floor beside the overturned bookshelf. And the photograph, my mother laughing on that porch, the glass cracked straight across her face like a wound. Linda was standing in the hallway when I turned around, and she immediately started talking before I could even open my mouth, explaining that she'd lit a candle to freshen up the room, because she thought it smelled a little stale, that she'd stepped out to take a phone call, that when she came back the curtain had somehow caught the flame, that she'd panicked and tried to put it out herself rather than call anyone because she didn't want to worry me in my condition. She said it all so smoothly, so rehearsed, that if I hadn't spent the last 6 years learning exactly how this woman operated, I might have believed her. But here's what she didn't know. 2 weeks earlier, after finding my jewelry box rifled through following one of her plant watering visits, I had installed a small camera inside the decorative bird figurine sitting on the nursery bookshelf, the kind you can buy online for $40, motion activated, syncing straight to an app on my phone. I hadn't told Daniel yet, because I didn't want another argument about how I was always assuming the worst about his mother. I just wanted proof, one way or another, so that I would finally stop feeling crazy. I said nothing to Linda that day except that I needed to sit down, that the smoke wasn't good for the baby, and could she please go home so I could call Daniel. She left quickly, relieved, I think, that I hadn't pushed back harder. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, I sat on the porch steps, hands shaking, and opened the app on my phone. If you've ever had that sick, sinking feeling of watching something confirm the worst thing you already suspected, you know exactly the moment I'm describing, and if this story is already gripping you the way it gripped me living through it, go ahead and subscribe to Silent Revenge Stories now, because what I found on that footage was only the beginning of what this woman had been doing behind my back for months. The footage showed Linda entering the nursery alone at 2:14 that afternoon. She did not light a candle for ambience. She walked directly to the bookshelf, picked up the framed photograph of my mother, and stared at it for nearly a full minute before setting it face down, deliberately, glass against the wood. Then she pulled the quilt from where it was draped over the rocking chair, folded it roughly, and set it inside the metal trash can. She did the same with several muslin swaddle blankets I'd embroidered with my mother's initials. Then, and this is the part that made my stomach drop through the floor, she took a lighter from her purse and set the pile on fire, standing there and watching it burn for almost 30 seconds before what I can only assume was panic, or the sound of a car outside, made her grab a water bottle from her purse and dump it over the flames, leaving the room half-charred, half-soaked, and entirely destroyed. She hadn't been trying to freshen the room. She had been erasing my mother. I sat on that porch for a long time before I could even process what I was seeing, and once I did, once the shock gave way to something colder and steadier, I didn't cry. I didn't call Daniel screaming. I saved the footage in 3 separate places, and I began to think, really think, about everything that had happened over the past 2 years that I had chalked up to Linda simply being difficult, and I started to see the shape of something far more deliberate. I remembered the misplaced ultrasound photo from my second miscarriage that Linda had insisted she never saw, though Daniel swore he'd shown her on his phone at dinner. I remembered the baby shower invitations that mysteriously never reached 3 of my closest friends, though Linda had personally offered to help address them. I remembered her repeatedly, almost obsessively, suggesting that Daniel and I move into the guest house behind her property, just until the baby is settled, a guest house with no lock on the nursery door she'd already picked out for us. Piece by piece, I began to understand that Linda wasn't simply cold or critical. She was systematically trying to remove every trace of my mother, and by extension, every trace of me, from the life my daughter was about to be born into. She wanted Grace to grow up surrounded by Carter family heirlooms, Carter family photographs, a Carter family legacy, with no room left over for the woman who raised me alone in a 2-bedroom apartment and never once made me feel poor. When Daniel got home that evening, I showed him the burnt nursery first, and I watched him go pale, his jaw tightening the way it does when he's trying not to say something he'll regret. Then I showed him the footage. I want to tell you that he immediately took my side completely, but the truth is messier than that, the truth of most families is messier than that, and for a moment he just stood there staring at his phone, watching his mother methodically destroy the only physical connection his unborn daughter would ever have to her other grandmother, and he said, quietly, "I need to call her." I told him no. I told him that if he called her right now, in this moment, she would talk her way out of it the way she talked her way out of everything for 6 years, that she would cry, that she would say she doesn't remember doing that she must have been in a fog from her blood pressure medication, and that by the end of the phone call, somehow, I would be the one who owed her an apology for installing a hidden camera. I told him we needed a plan, not a phone call. The tease I want to leave you with here, because we're only halfway through what actually happened, is this. 3 weeks later, at what was supposed to be Linda's carefully orchestrated, surprise grandbaby shower, in front of every member of the Carter family, including the aunt who had lent Linda money for that shower and the uncle who owned the venue, everything Linda had spent months trying to erase was about to be laid bare on a projector screen, and by the end of that night, it wasn't my mother's memory that would be destroyed. In the weeks that followed the fire, I did something I had never done before in 6 years of marriage. I stopped being polite. Daniel and I agreed, after several long, difficult conversations, that we would not confront Linda immediately, that we would instead let her believe she had gotten away with it, while quietly gathering everything else we needed. I contacted the 2 friends whose shower invitations had never arrived and learned, gently, that Linda had personally offered to mail them and simply never had. I asked my obstetrician's office, discreetly, whether Linda had ever called claiming to be me, something I'd suspected after a strange billing notice, and learned that yes, 3 months earlier, someone identifying herself as Emily Carter had called requesting a copy of my prenatal records be mailed to a different address, an address that, when I looked it up, belonged to Linda's attorney. That detail alone told me everything I needed to know about what Linda was truly planning, because you don't request a daughter-in-law's prenatal medical records through an attorney unless you are laying groundwork for something far more serious than redecorating a nursery, something that made my hands go cold when I first considered it, custody. Not now, not immediately, but somewhere down the line, if she could ever convince Daniel that I was unstable, unfit, unreliable, she wanted paperwork ready. The burnt nursery wasn't just cruelty. It was the opening move in a much longer game to slowly convince my husband that his own wife was the problem, so that eventually, Linda could position herself as the stable, steady presence Grace truly needed. I rebuilt that nursery from nothing over the next 3 weeks, and every single day I worked on it, I thought about my mother, about the diner shifts and the secondhand quilt and the porch where she used to sit with a cup of coffee before her shift, and I promised myself that this woman was not going to erase her, not while I was still breathing. I found a photo restoration service online that could repair the crack across my mother's photograph digitally and reprint it, and I had the porcelain rabbit's pieces glued back together by a specialty repair shop 3 towns over, visible cracks and all, because I decided I wanted Grace to see the scars, to understand one day that some things survive being broken. The shower Linda planned was, on the surface, a beautiful gesture, held at her brother's event venue outside Charlotte, 70 guests, a professional photographer, a custom cake in the shape of a bassinet. Linda had spent weeks telling everyone how excited she was to finally have a grandbaby, how she'd already started collecting heirloom pieces for Grace's real nursery, a phrase she used twice in front of me without any apparent awareness of how it landed. I smiled through every mention of it. I already knew what was coming. 3 days before the shower, I asked Daniel's cousin, who worked in event production and had access to the venue's projector setup for the planned slideshow of his family memories, if she would help me add something to the presentation, and she agreed the moment I showed her the footage, her face going through the exact same shock mine had weeks earlier. The night of the shower, everything unfolded exactly as Linda had planned, right up until the slideshow began. Family photos played first, sweet, ordinary images of Daniel as a baby, of Linda's late husband, of holidays long past, and then, seamlessly inserted between 2 innocent photographs, the footage began to play. 30 seconds of silent, time-stamped video, showing Linda alone in my nursery, face-down photograph, folded quilt, lighter, flame. The room went silent in a way I have never experienced before or since. Linda's sister gasped audibly. Her brother, the venue owner, stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. Daniel, standing beside me, didn't move, didn't speak, just watched his mother's face drain of every ounce of color as 70 people who had spent months hearing about her excitement for this grandchild now understood exactly what kind of excitement it truly was. Linda tried, predictably, to explain, her voice rising over the murmurs, insisting it was taken out of context, that I had set her up, that this was exactly the kind of manipulative behavior she'd always suspected from me. And for one terrifying second I watched her try to spin the room back in her favor the way she'd spun every room for 30 years. But this time, Daniel spoke before I had to. He stood up, and in a voice steadier than I'd ever heard from him, he told his mother that he loved her, that he always would, but that what she had done in that nursery was not a mistake, was not an accident, and was not something he could excuse away anymore, not for his wife, and certainly not for his daughter. He told her, in front of every relative who mattered to her, that she would not be receiving early access, unsupervised visits, or a place in Grace's life until she got real help, and that the guest house offer was permanently withdrawn. I did not gloat that night. I didn't need to. Watching a woman who had spent 6 years making me feel small finally sit in a room full of silence she couldn't talk her way out of was, in itself, the quiet, complete revenge I'd been carrying inside me since the moment I saw that footage on my phone. Grace was born 6 weeks later, healthy, loud, and furious at the world the way all the best babies are, and the first thing I did once we settled into our newly rebuilt nursery was place my mother's restored photograph back on the shelf above the crib, right where it belonged. Linda has reached out a handful of times since then, through therapy, through cautious, supervised visits Daniel and I agreed to on our own terms, and I don't know yet whether she'll ever truly become the grandmother I once hoped for. But I know this. My daughter will grow up with the quilt her great-grandmother stitched, cracks and all, and she will know the whole story behind every mended piece in that room, because some inheritances are worth protecting, even from your own family. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to protect your peace from someone who was supposed to love you, I want you to subscribe to Silent Revenge Stories right now, and before you go, leave a comment telling me the one lesson you're taking with you from Emily's story tonight. Because I read every single one, and I promise you, your story matters just as much as this one did.